This is Dom Bettinelli, the CEO of SQPN, with a brief but very important message. For more than a decade, SQPN has produced the Catholic faith and pop culture podcasts that you love. We're a nonprofit organization, so it's only your generosity that lets us carry out our mission. We haven't run a fundraiser in 2 years, and that's why we need to ask for your help right now. Please make a pledge of whatever amount you can afford to help us continue providing your favorite podcasts, as well as exciting new ones we have planned. To make your pledge and find out about the free thank you gifts we'd like to send you, visit sqpn.com/give. That's sqpn.com/give. Thank you for your generosity. May we hear from you today? You're listening to episode 17 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries both natural and supernatural from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. And in this episode, we're talking about whether we're living in a computer simulation or any kind of other simulation, and whether it would matter if we are. This is a good one. This is, are you in the Matrix? Get ready to take your blue pill or the red pill. Yeah, I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me as always is Jimmy Akin. Hi, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
So before we get going, I wanted to remind folks to remember to like Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on Facebook. We have a Facebook page. Make sure to like the episodes that we post on Facebook, retweet them on Twitter, leave us comments, subscribe to the podcast if you don't already in iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, your favorite podcast app, or on YouTube, where if you listen to the episode on YouTube, make sure to hit the bell to get notifications of whenever we post a new episode. And above all, this is all in service to sharing the podcast so that other people can discover it. People have been loving this podcast. Actually, my kids this morning said, "Daddy, are you recording any new episodes soon?" I'm like, yes, we're doing that today. We're recording new episodes today. Then they're like, yay! My kids love to listen to this podcast. And I don't think it's just because they hear my voice. They love the content. So please help us grow the community and reach more listeners. People of all ages are loving it. We'll have more in feedback about how people are responding. So thank you, everyone, for listening. So we should get into the episode. But first, I wanted to kind of... I almost forgot to kind of reiterate a message that you heard at the beginning of the episode, which is our giving campaign is ongoing. And if this show is made possible, if you are enjoying the show, and I would assume you are since you're listening, it's made possible by the StarQuest Production Network, which we're a part of, and through SQPN, the supporters, longtime supporters. We've had supporters going back 10 years. Supporting SQPN through their donations and in other their prayers in other ways, but especially the donations which help pay our bills and keep us going. And you can do that too. You can join them by going to sqpn.com/give and becoming a patron of the show. And if you become a patron at certain different giving levels, we have some very nice gifts that we're willing to offer you, including some gifts related to this show, related to some of the topics we've talked about in previous episodes, some of the books that we've brought up that Jimmy has mentioned as resources. We will send copies of those to you, depending on your giving level, if you choose those, and you can see those for yourselves. So
go to sqpn.com/give, become one of our regular monthly Patreon supporters, and it's important that you do that because Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is one of a number of new podcasts that StarQuest launched. And we did so stepping out, as a leap of faith, trusting that the donors would be there to underwrite it, because with these new podcasts, they have new costs. I am not receiving any compensation for this, but there are costs that are, associated with producing the show and getting it uploaded and making it available in so many places and so forth. And we, stepped out in faith, assuming that the donors would be there to support the show. And while some people have responded, we're not where we need to be at this point in our giving campaign. So we really do need to hear from you. This is a great time, December, to go ahead and make a donation. It can even help you with your taxes for next year. It also is the season of giving as we come to the anniversary of God's greatest gift to us, his own son. And so it puts people naturally in a giving mood. This is when most nonprofit organizations like StarQuest make most of their money during the year. So we really do need to hear from you. Please go to sqpn.com/give, become one of our regular monthly Patreon supporters, and thank you so much for your generosity.
So our topic today, as I said at the top, is are we in a simulation and does it matter? So, Jimmy, can you explain what this? I've heard people talk about this before, but I'm sure this is news to some of our listeners.
Yeah, so probably the biggest example of this in pop culture is the Matrix movies. In the Matrix movies, Keanu Reeves discovers that even though he's been living an ordinary life as a person in a modern society, that really he and everyone else he knows is plugged into an elaborate computer simulation. And so he's been living in a dream world all of his life. And that's something that comes as a big surprise to him. But it's something that actually has been proposed in a serious way and that various philosophers and scientists are taking seriously today as something that may not just be science fiction. The basic argument, and so we move into the claims section now, the basic argument was made in 2003 by a philosopher named Nick Bostrom. And he said, okay, look, right now, today, we are producing computer simulations of various events. We model weather, we model all kinds of different things, we model subatomic particle interactions. We use computers to simulate all kinds of different scenarios. Some of these scenarios involve our own ancestors. We have games like, build Western civilization games and things like that. And we're also experiencing a dramatic rise in the quality of computer technology, and our simulations are becoming more and more sophisticated. And so he wondered, could we one day get to such a level of technological sophistication that our scenarios would so closely mirror what we experience in real life that they would be, at least from within the scenario, indistinguishable from real life. In that case, we would be living in a simulation and not even be aware of it. We ourselves would be part of the simulation, just characters in the simulation, and not even realize it. And so he said, okay, it looks like there would be sort of three possibilities. The first possibility is that the fraction of human-level civilizations that reach a post-human stage, that's one capable of running high-fidelity simulations about their ancestors, is very close to zero. In other words, that for some reason this just doesn't happen. Either these societies wipe themselves out, or the computer technology stalls out before the simulations can get to this level, or something. So the number of civilizations capable of doing this might be very close to zero. Or, second possibility, the fraction of post-human civilizations that are interested in running ancestor simulations is very close to zero. So as they get on this scenario, they get up to a certain level and they're really not interested in running simulations about their ancestors the way we are. And then the third possibility, if neither of the first is true, if there are lots of civilizations that can run ancestor simulations in high fidelity, and if they're interested in doing so, then there would be a huge number of simulations compared to just one base reality that's not a simulation. And so on this third possibility, the fraction of all people with our kind of experiences who are living in a simulation would be almost one. It would be almost 100% chance that we're living in a simulation, one of the many countless simulations running somewhere on a computer, as opposed to just being in that base reality that's not a simulation.
Okay, so just to be clear, we're looking at, to say in a future compared to ours. So we're not yet at the stage where we could create a simulation of our world that of such high fidelity that it's almost indistinguishable from reality to the people, quote unquote, inside it, the intelligences inside it. So
the AIs.
So, but if we posit that sort of thing is a possible future, then in that possible time frame, that possible future, they could create such a thing as these artificial intelligences, and they might want to, and if they have the technical ability, if they have the desire, then the vast majority of people, intelligences, artificial and real, the vast majority of those would be the artificial kind.
Correct. Because at least the way we run simulations, we don't build a simulation and run it just once.
Yeah.
We model something lots of different times to see what happens, and consequently, for every one simulated, we don't have just one version of a simulation. We've got lots of iterations of it, and we would then be the artificial intelligences in one of those. The odds would be that we would be an artificial intelligence in one of the simulations as opposed to a non-artificial intelligence in the base reality, just by the luck of the draw.
Okay. So we can get into to what all that means as we go through the reason and faith perspectives. But we sort of have a base to start the discussion on by starting here.
And so the question then becomes, well, what are the odds of these three options being true, or which one of them is true, if any? And Bostrom did not assign any probabilities to them, although I think more recently he said he thinks they're kind of equiprobable, that no one option stands out among the others as being, this is clearly the most probable. Other people have taken positions on what they think the probability is that we're living in a simulation. Elon Musk, the industrialist, is famous for having said he thinks the odds are billions to one that we are living in a simulation. So he thinks the odds are overwhelmingly large that we are living in a simulation. Neil deGrasse Tyson, the astronomer, on the other hand, has said he thinks it's about 50-50 that we're living in a base reality or that we're living in a simulation. So those are kind of the pro simulation claims. The basic counterclaim then is, nope, we're just not living in a simulation. We're living in a base reality.
Okay. That if we were to run an advanced artificial intelligence simulation, it would never be so advanced that the intelligences inside would be indistinguishable from us.
Well, there we're getting into arguments for why of the people who make the counterclaim. The basic counterclaim is just that we're not living in a simulation.
All right, we'll get into the arguments. Okay. So so what do we what is the evidence? What's the facts that we could draw from in order to examine these claims?
Well, in terms of what we can all agree on, the kind of what we know material. We know that we do, in fact, live a good chunk of our lives in simulations. We call them dreams. We don't fully understand why dreams occur, but it's clear that they do, and we spend a lot of our time living in a simulation and not even realizing it, because unless you're experiencing the phenomenon known as lucid dreaming, you're not typically aware of the fact that you're dreaming when it's happening, and it seems like everything around you is real, and even though it behaves in a way different than waking life, it's something that you don't really question. And so we do know that it is possible for us to be in a simulation and not even realize it, because that happens to us every single night. We also know that we are currently making simulations of events in computers. And we know that some of those model human experiences. For example, there's the popular online game Minecraft, where people have a kind of simulated online life that they live. Also, even without human involvement, like playing a game. We have other simulations of human experience. I remember watching a documentary, one of the bonus features on a DVD for one of the Lord of the Rings movies. And they were talking about how they used CGI, computer-generated imagery, to produce battle sequences of these large armies, for the battle sequences in Lord of the Rings. And they had programmed each of the soldiers that was depicted in the army with a certain kind of autonomous decision-making process, so really primitive AI. But they were programming them based on what was happening around them to make decisions about, like, do you advance and attack? Do you retreat? Things like that. And the CGI artists were amused by the fact that in one huge battle sequence, they happened to notice that one of the soldiers was so surrounded and in such an overwhelmingly bad position with people around him, he just ran away and left the battlefield. and so we do know that we use simulations to model human experiences, and and we know we're rapidly increasing in our sophistication with regard to these simulations. Even the ones in the Lord of the Rings, those would not have been possible 10 years before they made that movie.
Yep. And what they're doing now with it is so much even more advanced, I know, than some movies. Like World War Z was an advancement on that, and that was even more technically advanced in the just what they had when they had the zombie attacks, these armies of zombies and that sort of thing, and then even stuff that we see in movies that are coming out today. I think most audiences don't realize how much of the movie is completely AI and computer generated without actual people involved in it at all.
Yeah. And so we know that we use simulations of human experiences, including, kind of ancestor-like things like Lord of the Rings, to both for entertainment purposes, and we also use them, even though they don't get as much press, we also use things like that for research purposes. Mm-hmm. So all of those are basic things that we can agree upon, whether or not you're pro or anti-simulation.
Okay. So if we approach this, say, from the perspective of reason, so what does reason tell us about this likelihood of that we're living in a simulation?
Well, because we have increasing sophistication in computer technology, we can expect, and we've seen that happening over the last number of decades, we have every reason to think that that's going to continue into the future. The question is, will it continue unabated? There's a famous law that people may have heard of called Moore's Law, which says that basically, there are different versions of it, but basically the computing power we have at our disposal doubles every 12 to 24 months. And Moore's Law has worked for a number of decades, but it's showing signs that it may not continue in the future. In fact, some people would say it's already been broken, that computer technology is no longer moving forward at that rate, in part because we're coming to the limits of what you can do with silicon. Computer chips are made out of silicon is one of the key atoms that's used in one of the key elements that's used in computer chips. And in order to make chips faster and faster, you need to have them operating on smaller and smaller scales, but you just can't get below a certain point with atoms. And so we may hit a barrier that we can't move beyond. Now, there are hopes that we can move beyond silicon-based computing to what's called quantum computing, which would take us down to computing at the level of subatomic particles. And thus, we'd achieve a new, smaller scale and new, faster speeds of computation. And they're currently working on quantum computing, but it's not really there yet. It's certainly not commercially available. And so there's a question of just how far in the future will this trend of increasing computer sophistication continue? And it's perfectly legitimate to argue, and some people do argue, that there's a limit to how big we can make computers, how fast we can make them, and consequently, there would be a barrier to creating the kind of realistic world ancestor simulation that the simulation hypothesis proposes, that it just wouldn't be feasible either technologically or economically for computers, for civilizations to make a large number of such simulations. And if they're not able to make a large number of such simulations, then the odds that we would be living in one would be very low. So this is kind of embracing Bostrom's first option, that the number of such civilizations capable of making this type of simulation is close to zero. And that's just based on, that argument's just based on computing power. But I also mentioned another one, another reason that that might keep the number of such civilizations low, which is they might kill themselves off. This is a proposal that we have already mentioned in our discussion of the Fermi paradox. Why don't we hear more aliens chattering in outer space? It may be that once you discover element 92, uranium, and some of the elements that follow it, like element 94, plutonium, that you start building atomic bombs and wiping yourself out, or you develop a plague and wipe yourself out, or something happens and you wipe yourself out. And that would also keep the number of civilizations capable of building robust ancestor simulations close to zero.
And then, there are other issues such as, even if we have the computing power, would we have the software needed to program all of the trillions of variables? Just look at your surroundings right now and think of all the variables of everything surrounding you. Like just the computer screen in front of me has millions of pixels, and you have to model that screen somehow. The complexity of such a simulation is mind-boggling, and so so whether you have the hardware, you might not have the software, but even then there are things like it also posits this idea that and you kind of Bostrom brings this up. Do we even need will we even need such simulations in the future?
Right, and this gets to a second line of attack on the simulation hypothesis, which is that any civilizations that are advanced enough to make this kind of simulation, they would be past the point of needing to make large numbers of them. If you can really model the world in such detail that you're going to get a simulation right, then you, with a high degree of confidence, then you don't need to run it a bazillion times.
Right.
And so you just run it once and you know the answer to your problem. So you don't need it for research purposes. Also, do you need such high fidelity simulations for entertainment purposes? Can't you entertain yourself in other ways that don't require a simulated world of that degree of sophistication, where you have billions of AIs living in it that are not aware of the fact that they are in a simulation, even though they're equal in intelligence to an ordinary human being? We can entertain ourselves by watching Lord of the Rings. We didn't need to make the simulations in that have actual human intelligence.
Right.
Even the one who had the smarts to run away didn't have actual human intelligence. So it's just questionable whether a sufficiently advanced civilization would have either research or entertainment needs for building a large number of robust simulations. Okay. So that would kind of go for Bostrom's second of the three options, that even though there may be a lot of civilizations that have the technology to run these things, they just don't have an interest or a need in running lots of them. Okay. And if they don't run lots of them, then the odds that we're in one are correspondingly low.
So is there other reason-based evidence against that we're living in a simulation?
Yeah, the fact that we're conscious. This is something that is very difficult to explain scientifically. Consciousness is a notoriously difficult problem to crack because it doesn't seem to arise, from what we can tell, from inanimate matter, and it doesn't seem to arise in computer programs. but we are clearly conscious. We have a first-person experience that is very hard to explain scientifically. In scientific circles and philosophical circles, this is known as the hard problem of consciousness. And we really do not have a scientific theory at all of what consciousness is or how it arises or how it operates. You'll hear people say things like, well, it's an emergent property that appears from certain kinds of physical interactions. But that's like saying gravity makes things fall down. It doesn't tell you why this happens.
Right.
It's just noting a correlation between these phenomena. And so we just do not have a scientific theory of consciousness, which will come back in the faith perspective, as we'll talk about. But a lot of people, even without a faith perspective, have said the fact that we are conscious and that computer programs are not gives us reason to think that we are not living in a computer program.
So, we don't even know how our own brains, even if that's even the seat of our consciousness, where our consciousness resides, but we kind of speculate, the popular speculation is somehow all that electricity running through our brain equals me thinking, a thinking person. We don't even know how that works. So how could we possibly consider that we could figure this out in a computer simulation, an AI, make that conscious? We're not even close to making a conscious AI. Is kind of the argument.
Right, and the argument is not simply that we wouldn't know how to do this. It's you could theoretically create an AI that has the same sophistication as a human being in theory, so that you could ask it any question and it would produce a meaningful response. And if it produces responses that are as believable as the ones an ordinary human would produce, it's then said to have passed the Turing test after Alan Turing, the British mathematician who proposed this idea. And so you could theoretically come up with an AI that is as sophisticated a thinker as a human being, but it would still be a toaster. It
Right.
wouldn't actually, it might talk like a human and say, I'm having a nice day, but it wouldn't actually have the first person experience of experiencing a nice day. It would just be manipulating the symbols, the words, I'm having a nice day, but wouldn't have any actual understanding in a conscious sense of what they mean.
Okay. I think I understand that. So that's a powerful counter argument against the idea that we're living in a simulation. Now, from a faith perspective, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say, from a faith perspective, this would be bunk.
Okay.
So, but am I right?
Why would you say that?
Well, that if we're persons made in the image and likeness of God, that God will that mitigates us against being a simulation, because image and likeness is not the same thing as a simulation. Maybe now I'm unsure as I say it out loud.
Yeah, because our image, if we're made in the image and likeness of God, doesn't that sound like we're a simulation of God in some sense?
That does. Okay, I'm going to need you to guide me through this.
We're simulating some aspects of God.
Yes. See, folks. This is why it's Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, not Dom's Mysterious World, because Jimmy's going to help me to reason through this from a faith perspective. So why don't I let you do that?
Well, I would say that, and I'm skeptical of the simulation hypothesis. I think that the arguments that, just from the reason perspective, make it quite unlikely that we would be living in a simulation. But, people still wonder, well, let's suppose it was true. Would that make a difference from a faith perspective? And I don't think it would. I don't think it would make a fundamental difference in things. So let's think from a faith perspective, and let's just give the simulation hypothesists their preferred theory, that the world as we experience it is a simulation. What would that mean for us as people of faith? Well, there are three key elements that the faith tells us about. One of them is God himself. Another is the world that God has created. And another is our individual souls. And so if we're experiencing a simulation, What does that mean for those three things, God, the world, and the soul? Well, God's existence is proved by philosophical arguments. So God's existence would not be challenged even if we are living in a computer simulation. There would still be a God who was needed to create the base level of reality in which resides the massive server farm that is housing our simulation. So God's existence is totally unaffected by the simulation hypothesis. What about the world? Well, the world, if we're in a simulation, is still real in a couple of different senses. There's the base level reality, that's real, that, you know, the one that contains the big server farm running the simulation. So that level of reality is real, and God created it. What about the world that we experience, the one that is a simulation? Well, we have always had a question about what's the nature of the world we find ourselves in. In classical physics, it was thought that the world we experience is made up of 4 or 5 elements, air, earth, fire, water, and sometimes quintessence. Then, more recently, in modern physics, it was proposed that actually the world that we experience is made up of atoms, and that became atomic theory. And eventually that was refined so that we now understand subatomic particles down to the, quark and lepton level. Maybe there's a deeper kind of particle, strings or something like that, even further down. But it's just, we still experience the world either way, whether you're explaining it by the classical 4 elements or by the modern 118 or the 17 subatomic particles that are part of the standard model now. What does it matter if you then say, well, okay, the world as we're experiencing it is real. We are experiencing it. It's just made out of patterns of information. In fact, some people who favor atomic theory will say maybe it turns out fundamental particles are just information in some way. Information is very important to quantum physics, and so maybe there's a kind of blending on a certain level between the idea that the world as we experience it is made of patterns of information, whether you conceive of them as the kind of subatomic particles that we're used to talking about, or as patterns of information existing in a computer medium. So it doesn't, to me, seem to matter how you explain from a faith perspective. It obviously matters from a scientific perspective, but from a faith perspective, it doesn't matter which material you propose the world we live in to be made out of, whether it's the 4 classical elements, the modern understanding of subatomic particles, or patterns of information, or something else. This world is still real. We still experience it, and it ultimately is a part of God's creation. So that wouldn't bother me from a faith perspective. When it comes to the soul, well, we've already mentioned the hard problem of consciousness. There seems to be we just do not have even the beginnings of a scientific explanation for what consciousness is and why it exists. That suggests it's something that is separate from the, at least in some way, separate or distinct from the physical world in which we find ourselves. And that gives us reason to believe in the soul. Now, if the simulation hypothesis were true, that would then mean that our souls are tied to and interacting with patterns of information instead of tied to and interacting with subatomic particles. But so what? Our souls still exist. They're still interacting with another medium that's the basis of physical reality, and the essentials of the faith are preserved. Now, you might say, well, it seems implausible that our souls are interacting with patterns of information in this way. And if so, that gives you a reason to doubt the simulation hypothesis. On the other hand, I'm not sure why it would be particularly more difficult to think of souls interacting with patterns of information than souls interacting with subatomic particles. but either way, the essence of the faith is preserved. So I don't think that the fundamentals of the faith would really be affected if the simulation hypothesis were true.
So according to this theory, we are, even if we're simulations, we're still true persons with an eternal, immortal soul, an eternal, immortal fate of one sort or another, and an existence goes beyond it. So someone might say, well, if we're created by a programmer in a computer, how does that make us? Does that make the programmer God instead of the real God?
No.
Okay.
That the programmer in that case would just be an intermediate step. It would be a form of secondary causation. This is something you can read about in the Catechism, where it talks about how God uses secondary causes to achieve his ends. Mm-hmm. And so we've already seen an example of a conceptual hurdle like this with biological evolution. So the way the Bible presents it in Genesis, it gives us the fundamental theological truth: God made the world and God made us. And he made us in part from the materials that are in the world. He used the dust of the earth to make Adam's body and so forth. And so these represent theological truths. God really did all this stuff, but it doesn't tell us how God did all this stuff. That's something that we have a clearer picture of as a result of modern science. It looks like there were intermediate steps that Genesis doesn't mention because the author didn't know about them. Where you had intermediate biological forms leading up to the bodies of the first humans. And in the same way, if you said, okay, there's a computer programmer who built a big server farm and designed the software, that doesn't make the programmer God. It just means God used the programmer and the server farm as intermediate steps in producing us, the same way he used intermediate biological life forms to produce us. The fundamental truth, we are God's creation, still remains solid. This would just fill in additional details about how God did it. Now, you may say, well, I don't find this at all plausible. Well, fine. I don't believe in the simulation hypothesis anyway. I'm just saying if it were true, right, it wouldn't affect the substance of the faith. The programmer would just be another intermediate cause that God used, just like he used, apparently, intermediate biological forms in the chain of causes leading to mankind.
And perhaps there might be some analogy related to how a husband and wife make a child, co-creating a child with God. When a child is born, they are the creation both of their parents, but also of God. Yeah, bear some thinking about. Maybe some philosophers going to
parents are intermediate causes, but God is still responsible for the child, and in particular for the child's soul.
Okay, wow, very. My mind expands every time we have these these discussions, Jimmy. So my mind is expanding even as we think, or as we talk about this. Even as we think, that was a little Freudian slip. But anyway,
yeah, we are thinking.
Any other things we need to talk about under the faith perspective?
One thing that I think is interesting, because you referred to the fact that, we have these immortal souls, and thus we have an eternal destiny. And one wonders, so first I got to tell a joke. This is a joke from years ago. So Bill Gates dies and goes to the pearly gates, and St. Peter shows him what it's going to be like in heaven, and gives him a choice of whether he wants to go there. And so he shows him this, all this realms of glory and light and joy and happiness and all this stuff. And Bill Gates says, yes, I definitely want to go there. So St. Peter pushes the button. Instantly, Bill Gates is surrounded in fiery lava. And he says, what happened? And St. Peter says, sorry, Bill, that was just the demo. And for anybody who's had a disappointing experience with computer technology, once you actually install it, yes, that has some relevance, and seem to in this situation, since we're talking about simulated eternal destinies.
Yes.
But let's pose the question seriously. So the faith teaches us that there is a heaven and hell, and that we will one day be living in a new heaven united, or in a new earth united to a new heaven. that new Earth could be a renovated version of this one, or it could be an entirely new creation. That's something that is a theologically open question. If we bring the simulation hypothesis into it, the question would then be, would God simply renovate the current simulation and upgrade it, and still leave our souls interacting with it? Would that be the new heaven and the new earth? Or would God end up having our souls attached to an entirely new and better simulation? Or would he attach our souls to a base level reality at that point that's not a simulation? It seems to me that and obviously I have inclinations. I think we're living in a base level reality anyway. Mm-hmm. So I think we're going to be in a base level reality in the new heaven and the new earth. But from a faith perspective, if the simulation hypothesis were true, then any of those would be possibilities, and we'd ultimately have to leave the nature of the new earth in God's hands, which is where it's always been.
Of course. It comes to mind that this is not unrelated from the multiverse quantum theory of existence, where there are an infinite number of nearly identical universes simulating, or if we want to use the same terminology, every possible decision point, and that sort of thing. And this is not unrelated to that, is it?
There are points of similarity, and we will be talking more about the multiverse in an upcoming episode, probably several.
Yes. I was going to make a multiverse joke, but no point there. So just imagine the multiverse joke that I made in some other multiverse. So the bottom line here on whether we're living in a simulation is what, Jimmy?
Well, speaking from a reason perspective, the simulation hypothesis is very far from being proved, and one is quite within one's epistemic rights to say that I don't think we are in a simulation. But even if it were true, it ultimately wouldn't matter from a faith perspective, and it also doesn't matter from a practical perspective. We still, regardless of the nature of the world we're living in, we still need to live life. We still need to get on with life. And you may notice that Elon Musk, who thinks we are in a simulation, is doing exactly that. He's getting on with his life. He's investing in new projects. He's hoping to go to Mars. He's hoping to do all kinds of things, even though he thinks it's all a simulation. Ultimately, it doesn't matter from a practical perspective. We still need to get on with life.
Excellent. So if folks want to learn more about this topic, what further resources do we have for them this week?
I have an article that I wrote about this on my blog, and so we'll have a link to that in the show notes. It's called Would It Matter If We're Living in a Simulation? Also have a link to the simulation hypothesis article in Wikipedia, and an article linking to what Elon Musk and some other folks have said about the simulation hypothesis.
Excellent. So go check that out, folks. So now we'll move on to our mysterious feedback, where we get feedback from you, the listeners. And our first feedback is on the episode we did recently on the Antichrist. That was episode number 11. And Jason and the gang on YouTube, I'm not sure if it was actually a group of people writing this, but he says, I'm scared of this evil figure of the Bible, and I bet he will be in Satanism, the leader of this religion of the devil. I can't hear you, Jimmy.
It's an interesting idea. Obviously, the Antichrist is in league with the devil in Scripture, and he could be a conscious Satanist who consciously worships the devil. That's quite possible. I'm not sure that it's essential, though, because if you look in the book of Revelation, and you have the figure of the beast, and the beast is not actually called, this is something we talked about in our Antichrist episode, the beast of Revelation is not referred to as the Antichrist. It's possible that they're the same figure, or that the beast is one manifestation of the Antichrist. But notice that the beast, and we'll be talking about this more in future episodes, is identified in a special way with the line of early Roman emperors, and in particular with the Emperor Nero. Well, Nero, even though Satan was behind his activities, was not a conscious worshiper of Satan. Nero worshipped the Roman gods, as did the other Roman emperors. And so even though Satan was behind the activity of Nero and his persecution of Christians, that didn't mean that Nero consciously worshipped Satan. And in the same way, I would say it may be that the final Antichrist may be self-deceived and may not consciously worship Satan, even though he's doing Satan's bidding.
Okay. Then Tammy Kitchener, also on YouTube, wrote, I love this talk. I'd really like more talks on the book of Revelation.
And we will be happy to provide those. Revelation is one of my favorite books to study, and we will definitely be talking about it in future episodes.
Plenty of mysteries to mine in the book of Revelation. And then Jason wrote on our Facebook page, he says, I just wanted to tell you directly how much I'm enjoying Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. I share your interest in many of these topics, and I appreciate and admire your diligence, thoroughness, and fairness in how you tackle these questions. As you've always done in any number of formats, you've shown so much charity toward folks of different viewpoints while being fair to their arguments and respectfully but compellingly putting forward your own. Thank you for doing the podcast. And then he finishes by saying, I signed up today to be a regular Patreon supporter. Thank you, Jason, very much. We greatly appreciate that. Thank you.
And thank you also, Jason, for your kind words. I appreciate them very much because it shows that you understand, you get what I'm trying to do, which is explore interesting topics and interact with other viewpoints in a way that's charitable and that is evidence-based. And so I appreciate that. Thank you so much, and thank you for your generosity on Patreon, and I hope other people will support us as well on Patreon. Just go to sqpn.com/give.
So, and that's our feedback for this week, and then we'll move on to mysterious headlines. What are the mysterious headlines this week, Jimmy?
So the Times of Israel has an article on a 2,000-year-old ring that's been discovered that has the name Pilate on it, as in Pontius Pilate. This ring was found in Israel a number of decades ago, and they didn't even realize what it was until recently when they cleaned it and discovered what the inscription said. Previously, it was found in the Herodium, which was a fortress that Herod the Great had built, and so there's a plausible connection there how the ring could have gotten into the Herodium, and it's probable that this ring was not itself owned by Pontius Pilate. It's a sealing ring, that is, a ring that you would use to impress wax seals or clay seals on documents as a mark of authentication. But it's made out of copper, and it's we would think that Pilate's own sealing ring would be made out of a more noble metal, like, say, gold. So this was, they think, unless Pilate had a spare copper ring that he wore ordinarily, it's thought that this isn't Pilate's own ring. It may be, though, a ring that was owned by a middle-class person or who was like maybe one of Pilate's freed slaves, because it was very common when slaves were emancipated for them to take the name of their former master as a sign of gratitude for freeing them. And so, in fact, that was customary in Roman society. So Pilate might have had a slave that he emancipated and who then took the name Pilate, but Pilate was not a common name in Roman society. And to find this ring in Israel, of all places, in the Herodium with a 1st century date, strongly suggests that it's in some way linked to the biblical Pilate, and that makes it only the second ancient inscription we found that refers to Pontius Pilate. The first was a step that had an inscription mentioning Pilate that we found in Caesarea Maritima in Israel, and so this would be a second ancient inscription mentioning Pilate.
Well, that's one of the interesting things about Pilate is, he's in the Bible, the most well-known book in the world, frankly. And so we kind of assume he must be some major, just a key figure in history. But in fact, there is not a whole lot of archaeological evidence about Pilate, apart from these two.
In secular history, he's mentioned, but not a lot, and there's not a lot of archaeological evidence. Incidentally, I'll mention one thing that I think is credible about this ring. Because of the number of frauds that have appeared on the antiquities market recently, I am reflectively skeptical of any major intriguing find like this.
Mm-hmm.
But in this case, I think it's plausible because they've had this ring for decades. We know it was unearthed by an archaeologist. It didn't just mysteriously appear on the antiquities market. We know who dug it up. We know when it was dug up. We know where it was dug up. And they didn't even realize its significance for decades.
Right.
They've had it all this time, and it was only when they cleaned it they found out what it was. So to me, that says this sounds authentic.
That's cool. Excellent. So another headline? Do we have another one?
Yeah. The military culture website, We Are the Mighty, has an interesting story that relates to one of our previous programs. We did a program on Area 51, and I believe I mentioned in Area 51 an account that I first read in Annie Jacobson's book on Area 51 about early jet fighters during World War II. The first jet fighters were here in America were top secret. And so they were flying them out in the desert in California. And to keep the secret, when they were taxiing the jet onto the runway, they would put a fake wooden propeller on it, because that's one of the things that jets don't have propellers.
Mm-hmm.
And so they would put a fake wooden propeller on it as they would taxi it out. So anyone seeing the plane taxiing out would think it's some kind of ordinary plane. It's not a revolutionary new technology. And then they would take the propeller off and it would fly. But then you had the problem of, what about pilots seeing it in the sky? How do you keep the secret there when it doesn't have the propeller on? And one guy, his name, it turns out, is Jack Woolhams, decided, I'm going to put on a gorilla suit and a derby hat while I'm flying the plane. So anybody who comes back and sees the plane and says, I was up in the sky, I saw this other plane, it had no propeller, and it was being flown by a gorilla in a derby hat, would sound nuts. And that's exactly what happened. And in fact, they had military psychiatrists talking to these guys, convinced them that they were hallucinating, that up at altitude, when the oxygen is low, you can hallucinate things like this. And that's part of how they kept the secret. So I'd heard that story. I hadn't known the name Jack Woolhams, but We Are the Mighty has an article on the subject with a picture of Jack. And so if you want to check that out, see the show notes. The article is called Test Pilot of First USAF Jet Fighter Dressed as a Gorilla to Mess with Other Pilots.
That's awesome. Oh, the early days of the U.S. Air Force, the culture then is a bit crazy, Wild West. Excellent. So that's it for our headlines, and that's it for our podcast this week. So we put it out to you folks. What did you think of our discussion on whether we're living in a simulation and whether it even matters if we are? Let us know by visiting sqpn.com/mysterious or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page. Find the link to this episode and leave some feedback there. Or you can send us an email to mysterious@sqpn.com. You can find the relevant links, including the further resources we talked about from this discussion and the links to the mysterious headlines on our show notes on sqpn.com. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thank you, Dom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest. This is Dom Bettinelli again. We hope you've enjoyed this podcast and that you'll help us keep producing the podcast you love. Thank you for your generosity. To make your pledge and find out about the free thank you gifts we'd like to send you, visit sqpn.com/give. That's sqpn.com/give.